This is our Simondon reading group. We're continuing our discussion of history of the notion of the individual. Last time we finished the Spinoza section that we had started the time before. So we looked at some of the, difficulties of the Spinozistic conception of the individual. So the individual for Spinoza, the sort of basic concept of an individual is a certain proportion of movement and rest in the body, and then the idea of that body is the soul of that individual. So there's a correspondence between this proportion of movement and rest, the order and connection in the body, and then the order and connection in the ideas that make up the soul, that make up the complex idea of this body. So this is sort of the basic idea of the individual, but there's a sort of, something that more subtle and complicated in the sense that this idea of the body is also capable of undergoing transformation, in particular in relation to knowledge of the third kind that Spinoza sets out in the Ethics. So when we have this knowledge of this intuitive knowledge of our union, or the fact that we're a component of the one substance, God or nature, when we have this intuitive knowledge, we sort of act upon ourselves. We undergo a transformation. So our knowledge of ourselves changes who we are or what we are, and so the individual is capable of undergoing this transformation through its sort of recognition of its being a part of something outside of the individual or greater than the individual. So this is one way in which the notion of the individual in Spinoza is more complicated than just this proportion of movement and rest. And then there's also the question about the formation of a state and the formation of collectives. Simondon doesn't go into this in a lot of detail, but there's this sort of strange phrase that Spinoza uses repeatedly when he talks about the formation of a state. He says he describes it as una veluti mentis ducitur, as if led by a single mind. And he always uses this qualification, as if or as it were or something like that, when he's describing the formation of a complex sort of quasi-individual out of multiple human individuals. And so a state is something like an individual, but maybe not exactly the same as a human individual. But it's this complex body made up of individual human bodies that interact with each other. And there's an idea or a sort of soul of this complex body as well. So this is tied up with his understanding of ethics, or in the theological political treatise, he described this as religion, but how the human being is for a human being what is most concordant. So interaction with other human beings is what best serves to increase my power of acting. And so through the interaction in this sort of proper sense, whether it's guided by reason or sort of regulated by the state, through this kind of interaction with other human beings, I increase my power of acting, and this is ultimately sort of the key central principle of Spinoza's ethics. This is what we are always striving towards, is to increase our power of acting. So again, the individual sort of realizes itself or manifests its capacities through interaction with something outside of itself. And so there's this kind of interaction between what's interior to the individual and what is exterior to the individual. So again, the notion of the individual for Spinoza is more complex and more subtle, I think, than is often recognized, and even in part by Simondon. I think he to some extent shares the traditional understanding of Spinoza as kind of subordinating the individual to the whole, the universe, or God or nature. I think Simondon sort of shares that conception to some extent and doesn't quite recognize the full subtlety and complexity of Spinoza's account of the individual. Okay, so I think that's all I wanted to talk about in the summary. So let's go on to the discussion of Malebranche. I'm on the wrong page here. Right, so we're picking up from page 584 of the PDF at the heading Malebranche. So I'll read the first page or so. In Malebranche's philosophy, a certain return to Platonism seems to demote the aspect of automatism that the conception of the individual presents in the authors inspired by Descartes. Nevertheless, by considering the transposition Malebranche imposes on the Cartesian system, we again find the fundamental and characteristic schema of Cartesianism in his doctrine of man's freedom. Man is God's creature. He possesses a movement that carries him towards the universal good, and he always has some force to go beyond the particular goods presented by his understanding. But without adding to or taking away from this force, man can control it as he sees fit. He can stop his will to a particular good, which constitutes sin. Man diverts toward a particular good the force that was given to him for the universal good. This explanation conforms with Cartesian physics, according to which the deviation of a movement requires no supplementary force. This principle is merely transposed from the physical to the mental, and yet the existence of such a capacity would in fact require a particular structure, that of an automaton involving a relay and possessing an energy within it that plays the role of control energy, which is as small as desired but not known. In his conception of the human individual, Malebranche was only able to make the doctrine of Descartes and the doctrine of Plato coincide due to an error of Cartesian physics, i.e. this principle according to which the deviation of a movement does not require any supplementary force. Indeed, due to this principle, Malebranche was able to consider that self-love is completely constituted by the impulse toward the universal good, or the good in general. The love of God is rooted in self-love because this self-love is in fact already fully constituted by the love of God. Quote, God wills that we will the perfection of our being, but with the invincible love that he has for the immutable order. Unquote. New quote. The desire for formal beatitude or pleasure in general is the ground or essence of the will, insofar as it is capable of loving the good. End quote. This impulse contains self-love within itself. Malebranche conserves from Descartes' system only the schema of freedom in the control energy of movement, and on the contrary, he refuses the self-constitutive nature of self-knowledge. The soul does not know its own essence. If the soul knew itself, it would be absorbed in the contemplation of itself. This second aspect of automatism, which is that through which the being affirms itself and discovers a normative power in its own activity, does not exist in Malebranche. Order, which for Descartes was the condition of coherence for the individual's activity, is no longer a constructive method but the plan of creation which we can contemplate. The individual can contemplate order, no doubt, but the individual does not posit the order through which he is universalized. Order is already given. Order is consequently discovered as a principle of nature and of grace. The architect, the constructor, is God, not man. What was a constructive norm of action for Descartes becomes the principle of the simplicity of paths. Here we find this parameter which, according to modern terminology, we have called information. God could have made the world infinitely more perfect in each of its parts, provided that he intervene every moment through the world's existence. But a machine that requires the perpetual surveillance of its constructor to regulate and control each of its parts through continual interventions in its functioning is less perfect than a machine that is less elaborate in each of its parts, but contains within itself the whole sequence of its functioning and does not require the presence of its constructor to repair it and regulate it throughout its functioning. Let's stop here. So this, I'm not going to have a lot to say about Malebranche because I have read very little of his work. He's, I think, kind of hard to read for contemporary readers, or at least for me. He's like extremely pious, and his texts are full of like Bible citations, and they're always in Latin as well, which again just makes it that much harder. So it's kind of hard to enter into his like mental universe compared to someone like Spinoza. But the little that I know, I don't think Malebranche ever describes anything like a relay in the sense that Simondon sort of attributes to him here. This is sort of Simondon's interpretation, I think, sort of guiding his understanding of Malebranche.
I have a quick simple question about information. The part 585, page 585, the 2 lines from the bottom.
Right.
So I'm just wondering, Simondon got an idea of information? Like as far as I understand, the Simondong's definition of information different from the the definition of information. So I'm just wondering, like, this information has to do with the Simondonian information or anything else?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Yeah, I think he's using here his own understanding of information. So it's information in that sense is a kind of capacity to bring about a structuration of something else. So it's like in a way, like in his sort of stock example of the crystallization experience. The germ crystal contains information because it's capable of bringing about the crystallization of the fluid. Um, it's capable of sort of bringing about this process of structuration in something that is not yet structured. And so I think he's sort of appealing to this notion of information here. Um, so there's something in this order that the world contains through its creation by God. There's a sort of principle of structuration in the world. The world isn't just a sort of chaotic fluid or jumble of elements, but it has this structuring capacity, and human action has to try to sort of accord itself to this order, as opposed to sort of imposing an order on the world.
So I can understand, like, Simondon just got us some hint of his constructing the idea of information. Not exactly same with this person Malebranche's information, right? Because Malebranche's information seems really kind of limited, just like following the God's order, which seems to have originally has some kind of limitation. And the information here
Yeah.
kind of yeah, sorry, the seed of
Oh,
thought,
sorry.
something like that. The seed of
Yeah.
thought.
Yeah, I think the term information here is not Malebranche's term. It's Spinoza, or sorry, it's Simondon
Mm.
interpreting what Malebranche is talking about. But Malebranche talks about order. So he thinks that the world has a certain order that is imposed or implemented by God, um, and then human action has to sort of align itself to this order, and then sort of deviating from that order, or taking to a sort of partial order, or sort of seeking the good of a partial entity rather than the good of the whole, is what sin consists in. And so having this sort of alignment of our action with the order of the world that is implemented by God is is what moral action consists in for Malebranche.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Right. So let's go on to the last little bit. It's kind of an awkward length, but the last bit of the Malebranche section. Angus, if you want to read.
Yeah, sorry. Which sentence are we starting on?
We are at the top of 5A6 in the PDF. It's in this sense, God shouldn't have.
Okay. In this sense, God shouldn't have to intervene in a particular way, i.e., through miracles, throughout the existence of creation. Certainly, he sustains the world in being, but according to general laws and never through particular actions. For Malebranche, the true automaton is creation, not man. Man, on the contrary, submits to these general laws. For God made the world according to the simplest, i.e., also the most general paths. For Cartesianism, the difficulty of conceiving individuality in a stable and coherent way therefore stems from two very distinct and independent aspects involved in automatism. First is that of the control of an effector energy by a control energy. The second is that of the circular causality through which the being acts upon itself. The connection between these two aspects was difficult without the intervention of a potential, which all Cartesian thought refuses. It was nonetheless intellectually possible thanks to the Cartesian principle concerning control energy. No energy is required to direct a movement. However, if we truly reflect on this notion, which is applied by Descartes to the problem of the interaction of substances in the human composite, and by Malebranche to the problem of sin, we see that there is an impasse in this attempt at a passage to the limit. An energy as small as we could desire is not a null energy. This suppression of any potential aspects of the individual to fully save his actual character leads to a result opposite the one that was sought. disappearance of the individual being's consistency. For Spinoza, the passage from the level of the first type of knowledge to the level of the second or third type is impossible by the individual himself. True individuality, that of essentia particularis affirmativa, can be constituted only as separate from determinations, which are negations. Descartes' dualism, Malebranche's occasionalism, Spinoza's opposition between knowledge of the first type and that of the other two are three manifestations of the same difficulty to conceive the individual according to a system of pure actuality. This idea that I guess I'm still not totally clear to me how bisubstantialism means that there can't be any. It's a suppression of the potential aspect of the individual. I mean, is the idea just that both substances are fully actual, and as a result, it's difficult or impossible to explain the interaction between them?
I don't think it's exactly the bisubstantialism that leads to the negation of the potential, but I think it's I think the bisubstantialism sort of follows from the negation of the notion of a potential. So Descartes, his physics is set out in opposition to the Aristotelian physics that was sort of predominant in the universities at the time, and in particular is opposed to the notion of potential that is one of the core concepts of Aristotelian physics. And like in a couple places he mocks the Aristotelian definition of motion as the actualization of the potential qua potential. He says this is sort of unintelligible and just sort of playing with words as opposed to a definition. And so Descartes' physics is a physics of the completely actual. It's everything is just portions of extension that are interacting through shock. Sorry, not shock. What's the English word? Impact. The different pieces of extension impact each other and follow simple mechanical laws. And there's never anything like a potential energy or a potential to become something different than what they are. And then another sort of aspect of this anti-Aristotelianism is the bisubstantialism sort of follows from this, because in Aristotelian physics there's a kind of continuity between living beings and intellectual beings, I guess we could say. So there's a different sort of types of soul or functions of the soul that coexist and are sort of in continuity with each other. So we have the vital soul, the sort of the nutritive soul that possesses the capacity to absorb nutrients and sort of reproduce the living being. There's the sensitive soul that has the capacity to receive, I guess, information, as we would say, from the surrounding world. And then there's the intellect, which only human beings possess. But each of these sort of capacities of the soul is sort of in continuity with each other, whereas Descartes wants to draw a strict distinction between the intellect. He sort of limits the existence of the soul or the capacities of the soul to the intellectual functions, and he wants to explain everything else in mechanical terms. So in the same way that so it's because of this denial of something like a function or a capacity or a potential in the living world that Descartes has to make the soul into a second substance that is sort of attached to the body or connected to the body in this mysterious way. And so the bisubstantialism sort of follows from the denial of the notion of a potential in the physics.
Thank you. That makes sense. Yeah, I guess maybe it's an instance of another problem of participation that arises when the philosopher fails to think potential energy. That's how Simondon would characterize it.
Yeah, I think for Simondon, it's because Descartes has no notion of the potential energy or of potential in general. He's kind of stuck when he needs to characterize what makes the individual, as opposed to just a sort of portion of extended substance that is delimited by thought. So there's this notion of the capacity for the individual to act upon itself that he points to in this passage that we just read. We're capable of controlling our thoughts, at least to some extent. We can decide what we want to do, what sort of actions we want to engage in. And this capacity of the individual to act upon itself is hard to understand unless if you have no concept of the individual as having potentials that can be realized or not. Simondon sort of extends this difficulty to Spinoza and Malebranche in different ways, as he discusses in that passage we just read. So for Spinoza, the difficulty is not the relation between the soul and the body, because that's just a sort of parallelism or correspondence. The soul and the body are just modes in different attributes of the one substance, as opposed to two different substances that have to interact in this mysterious way for Descartes. But for Spinoza, the dualism or the difficulty arises with the relationship between the first type of knowledge, which is imaginative, and then the second and third types of knowledge, on the other hand, which are rational and intellectual. And so this rational knowledge through common notions, or this intellectual knowledge, the intuitive knowledge of the third kind, are both instances where something outside of the individual intervenes on the individual, or the individual undergoes a transformation through its relation to something outside itself. And so this capacity to undergo this transformation is something that, again, is kind of hard to make sense of unless you think of the individual as having the potential for this transformation sort of contained within it, which is something that Spinoza doesn't really make a place for in his system.
Thank you. That makes sense.
Okay, so let's go on to the Leibniz section. I don't have a lot to say about Malebranche, as I said. Ollie, would you like to read the first page or so of Leibniz?
Sure. Leibniz, on the contrary, presents another way to conceive individuality by attempting to realize a vast synthesis of all the conceptions relative to individuality and of all the aspects of this notion. Which in fact reintroduces the notion of a potential reality in the individual, but he attempts to make it compatible with the notion of an automatism based on the mathematical paradigmatism of the series, which is ad infinitum determines terms that are always new but not contingent with respect to the origin of the series and to the first term. The concrete individual notion contains all the successive states of development for the individual that the monad is. The terms of the mathematical series, in fact, actual or non-actual with respect to the series itself. Does an undeveloped series contain actuality and potentiality at the same time? Leibniz founds his system of individuality on this aspect of the ambivalence of the series, which is determined and yet capable of infinite development. The notion of the individual is universalized because everything in the world is an individual. There are nothing but individuals, and these individuals are substantial. The monadology is a vigorous attempt to rationalize and systematize the paradox of individuality. We find in various ways in all developments of a Cartesian thought. However, the problem of individual freedom remains difficult to pose in this system. Leibniz does not, in fact, want to accept Descartes' postulate according to which it is possible to modify the direction of a movement without any force. Continue?
Yeah, let's stop here, actually. Yeah, that's good. Thanks.
Thank you, Joachim.
Yeah, if one of you could find EndNote 104, that is in that passage we just read. I think it's an important one for what comes later. If you could just post it in the chat if you get a chance, that would be very helpful. Yeah, so we start with Leibniz here, and Simondon argues that Leibniz sort of gets away from this problem that the Cartesian school or tradition had faced with the notion of the potential within the individual. And so Leibniz, on the contrary to Descartes, he tries to reconcile the new physics, the sort of post-Galilean physics, with Aristotelian physics, and so he thinks that we can sort of make use of these notions of an entelechy and potential and all these Aristotelian notions in connection with Aristotelian physics. In connection with contemporary physics of the 17th century. And one of the sort of aspects or uses that he makes of this notion of the potential is in the concept of the monad, which contains both which contains everything that will happen in the history of the monad's existence. So the example that he gives, I think in the monadology, is the essence of Julius Caesar, or the concept of Julius Caesar, contains every event that happens in Caesar's life. So the fact that he would cross the Rubicon, the fact that he would be assassinated, all this was contained in the essence of Julius Caesar. And the sort of life history of this monad, Julius Caesar, is just the sort of working out or the development of what was already there in this monad, from the beginning. And so there's this, I guess, ambiguity, as Simondon puts it, between the potential and the actual. So the potential is sort of thinking of Julius Caesar insofar as he has not yet crossed the Rubicon. He has the potential to cross the Rubicon. But then it's this crossing the Rubicon is actual in the sense that it's already contained in his essence in the concept of Julius Caesar. And so there's this ambiguity between the potential and the actual that Leibniz tries to work with in this notion of the monad. Okay, so sorry, go on.
Sorry, is that then Spinozian understanding of God, like God is nature, and that's kind of like as far as I understand, the kind of like the truth, something like that. So here, monad is kind of the nature of God, or something like that. It's already there, and then even though human extends their knowledge, we can't get over. I mean, that's always inside of the God's nature, something like that.
Yeah, the relation between Leibniz and Spinoza is a difficult one, in part because so Leibniz actually met Spinoza. I forget the exact year, but he traveled to the Netherlands. I don't think specifically to meet Spinoza, but he did meet him while he was there. And then later on, he tried to deny that he had met Spinoza because Spinoza was sort of infamous in European philosophy at that time as being like an atheist and an infidel and so on. And so Leibniz tried to sort of hide his connection with Spinoza, and Leibniz, in like not just in connection with Spinoza, but in general, he's very sort of diplomatic in his use of language, and he was actually a diplomat as well as a philosopher and a mathematician and so on. But he always tries to write to whoever he's writing to. He sort of expresses himself in terms of the other person's ideas, and so he always tries to agree with everyone, or to show himself as being in agreement with the other person's ideas. And so, in connection with Spinoza, it's hard to sort of make clear what the difference is between Leibniz and Spinoza in some respects. But one key difference that we'll see as we continue reading this section is that Leibniz makes a distinction between logical necessity and moral necessity that that doesn't exist in Spinoza. And so he argues that there's a logical necessity that determines what worlds are possible. So which essences or which monads are compossible, are sort of possible together. So the monad of Julius Caesar, who would be assassinated, is compossible with the monad of Brutus, who would assassinate him. So these are sort of possible together. And then out of all these different possible worlds, God selects the best possible one through moral necessity. So there's a kind of freedom in the sense that God is not determined to act to create the best possible world, but through moral freedom, God selects the best possible world out of all the worlds that are possible. So this distinction between a logical and a moral necessity um, is one aspect of how Leibniz tries to distinguish his own position from Spinoza's. So there's this freedom to select the best possible world that subsists within God's creation of the world, or God's choice of the best possible world in a way that we don't have in Spinoza.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and this is Leibniz with his nice 18th century wig. Yeah, 18th century style is pretty interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, before we go on to the rest of the passage, I wanted to, so I mentioned that footnote or endnote. So I'm just going to read this for anyone following along. So it's note 104 in the text. So I'll read that now. We have tried to account for this paradox of ambivalence and duality by invoking the notion of transductivity as characteristic of individual reality. Ambivalence is contained in the monadic series in the form of the identity of virtuality and actuality. Spinoza privileged external transductivity, that which ensures that the modes are parallel from one attribute to another, to the other, and incorporated internal transductivity into the external transductivity through the adequation of knowledge that is action at the same time. Leibniz carries out the opposite procedure by constituting internal transductivity and then incorporating external transductivity into internal transductivity due to the calculus of compossibles through God the Creator, who behaves as an individual fulfilling an act of internal transductivity. The Spinozist individual who accesses the third type of knowledge internalizes external transductivity. The Leibnizian God who creates the world according to the calculus of compossibles externalizes an internal transductivity. In this sense, none of Descartes' successors fully resolved the problem of the rapport between the two kinds of transductivity, which in Descartes seemed like a metaphysical problem of the communication of substances, but which is in fact a logical metaphysical problem, that of the rapport of two kinds of transduction. So this footnote, the reason why I wanted to call attention to it is, or one of the reasons is that it calls back to that long footnote 95 that we looked at in the Descartes section that we we spent, I think, half of a session almost going through it. It's like a page-long footnote. So here, this notion of the paradox of the individual is again is what he sort of starts from in that other footnote in the Descartes section, and so he here brings it up again, but he describes it in somewhat different terms here. So it's this relation between two kinds of transductivity. So the external transduction, this transduction that happens outside the individual, and then internal transduction, which is the transduction that happens inside the individual. And he characterizes some of the difficulties of Spinoza and Leibniz in terms of relating these two kinds of transduction to each other. And then so for Spinoza, there's the external transductivity is the relation between the modes of different attributes. So the relation between the human body and the human mind, for example. This is the external transductivity. And then the internal transductivity, which is the sort of operation of the ideas among themselves, is sort of incorporated into this external transductivity insofar as we have adequate knowledge. So if we have adequate knowledge or adequate ideas of entities, we the order and connection of those of our ideas is the same as the order and connection the things that we know through those ideas. So this is a kind of incorporation of the internal transductivity into the external transductivity. And then for Leibniz, we have the opposite direction. So within God, there's this internal transductivity, which is the selection of the best possible world, or of the greatest possible amount of being through the compossibility of different essences. This is all sort of taking place internal to God as a creator. And then the external transductivity, which Simono doesn't really specify what it would be here, but I think we can take it to mean the action of individuals in interaction with each other. So the way that Julius Caesar crosses the Rubicon, for example, this is sort of incorporated into the internal transductivity, into the selection of the best possible world by God. And so for Simondon, either of these approaches is kind of a reductive approach. So you either reduce the internal to the external, or the external to the internal, as opposed to having adequate conception of the relation between the two. And so this is, I guess, why he thinks that both Spinoza and Leibniz have a sort of inadequacy in respect to the understanding of the relation between these two kinds of transduction.
In the explanation you just given us, like the best possible word, in a way, it reminds me of the Candide, the by Voltaire. As far as I understand, like the lesson of that literature was like the best possible world, like something like that. And then I'm wondering, like, what aspect we can, I mean, Leibniz could say like the best possible world for human beings, or for God, or for anything else. So it's kind of, so think of like Caesar, I mean Caesar, and then the consequences like of the event, and then how can we say like that was the best possible world, something like that.
Yeah, this notion of the best possible world is something that was already controversial in his time, and of course Voltaire mocks it in Candide. Um, the idea, what makes this world the best possible world, is that it is the world in which there's the greatest possible amount of being realized. So out of all the essences of all the different monads, this world realizes the existence of as many of those essences as possible, or the greatest amount of being of those essences as possible. So it's not necessarily the best possible world for human beings, because we're only a small part of the universe. But it's out of all the possible worlds, out of all the possible configurations of the universe, this one is the one that realizes the greatest amount of being, or the greatest level of being out of all of them.
Yeah, I kind of like I feel like every that kind of idea is like try to just justify something inexplicable with the human sense. Like we can't totally like explicate like the what's going on, like because it something looks really unreasonable, something like that. And then Leibniz or other philosophers try to just like justify or try to, I mean, explain like in their ways, like by bringing that kind of ideas.
Yeah, there was in the 18th century, I forget the exact year, there was a huge earthquake that basically destroyed the entire city of Lisbon, and I think like tens of thousands or possibly hundreds of thousands of people died.
Mm.
And Voltaire talks about this. I think in Candide, he sort of mocks the idea that this horrible disaster was something that sort of is part of the greater good, or sort of contributes to the greater good, or something like that.
Mm.
Which it seems like this sort of Leibnizian optimism has to hold, that any whatever horrible events you can think of are actually part of the greatest possible good. And yeah, so this sort of optimism of Leibniz, it is definitely an aspect that a lot of people, even in his time, thought was difficult to accept. And yeah, like I think we have to, I guess, understand it in a ontological sense as opposed to a sort of moral sense. In saying that it's the best possible world, it means that it's the world that realizes the most possible existence, as opposed to saying that it's a morally good world in the sense that human beings might recognize.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank
so
you.
that's one formulation that he gives, is that it's the um, that this world is the one that's the richest in phenomena with the simplest laws. So God creates the world in such a way that it's governed by very simple laws that interact and produce all these sort of complex phenomena like living beings and the solar system and all this stuff that we observe in the world. And this is actually maybe sort of a side note, but there's actually a sort of tradition in physics of what are called variational principles, which are in part inspired by this Leibnizian notion, and also in part Leibniz's awareness of some of these principles inspired his understanding of the best possible world. But these are like there's the least action principle. Um, and there are certain physical phenomena that act in such a way as to minimize or maximize certain quantities. So, for example, when light passes from one medium to another, if I remember correctly, the formulation is that the angle of the refraction from one medium to the other is such that the length of the path that light travels is the shortest possible. And there are various principles like this in physics where either a quantity is minimized or a quantity is maximized by some physical phenomenon. And so these types of phenomena were the kinds of things that Leibniz had in mind when he talks about how these simple laws produce the sort of richest possible set of phenomena that God could have selected.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for explanation. Thank you.
Right. So let's go on to the next bit. If someone would like to read from Leibniz's intellectual method.
Yeah, I can read. Leibniz's intellectual method is based on a rapport that is generative of an infinity of terms. The mathematical infinitely small is an example of this. The infinitely small is indeed homogeneous with finite parameters. The infinitely small of the line is an infinitesimal line. Consequently, the rapport between two straight lines is independent of the absolute dimension of straight lines and can remain the same when these straight lines become infinitely small. However, the direction of a curve in one of its points solely depends on the determination of this rapport when these lines are infinitely small. This rapport therefore permits the analysis of the infinite because through it we can find the direction of the curve at any point whatsoever. Whence in every equation the paramount importance of the discovery of an algorithm that plays the role of the infinitesimal algorithm in the calculus of the infinite. The notion of individual substance is nothing but the series of its changes. In the same way, there is a law of the connection of individual substances. Problems related to individuality arise from an intelligibility of the infinite, which contributes to a notion whose fruitfulness is inexhaustible. The three fundamental principles of Leibniz are the principle of identity, the principle of sufficient reason, and the principle of continuity. Quote, what is remarkable must consist of parts which are not. Nothing arises all in one piece, whether it be thought or movement. Unquote. Reality is therefore an inexhaustible continuum. We cannot exhaust its parts. From the start in Leibniz's physics, there is a new vision of the properties of bodies. In addition to figure and movement, elasticity and certain internal forces must be attributed to bodies. This elasticity and these internal forces suppose the ad infinitum divisibility of bodies, which consequently would not have any exact determinate figure. One body differs from another, not due to figure or magnitude, but due to the internal force that it manifests. Descartes didn't respect this principle in his laws of the shock of bodies. He neglected the true constant intervening in the exchanges of movements, which is the product mass times speed squared. Living force is therefore particular more so to the body than to movement, such as Descartes defined it. Living force belongs to the body more concretely. Here there is a more perfect interiority of what we today call the energy relative to each body. For Leibniz, in a body, force is the permanent cause of all the actions it can perform, in all the passions it can undergo. It is the, quote, first entelechy, which corresponds to the soul or substantial form, unquote. This law of the constancy of force, what we today call kinetic energy in a body, is a veritable reality for Leibniz. The corollary to this law is the law of the conservation of the quantity of progress, constancy of the algebraic sum of the projection and speeds on an axis. Force inherent in the body accounts for all mechanical changes. Leibniz is opposed to Newton, as though to a physicist who needs a deus ex machina prevent a system like the solar system from ultimately destroying itself based on the action of gravitation. Only a bad artisan repairs the wheels of the machine he has created. Leibniz wants to make physics and metaphysics coincide, and toward that end, he wants the world to be a perfect automaton. The physical individual endowed with force is a simultaneous physical and metaphysical being. The set of all these beings does not require external intervention to function, but a universal definition of kinetic energy that would be valid in all such cases remains to be provided.
Right. So yeah,
This,
go
sorry.
ahead.
I was just going to say the way that he describes infinitesimal calculus is interesting here. I guess I hadn't thought of it as like what allows this relation between these, I guess, line segments to hold as they approach, or as they, approach zero infinitely, is the rapport between them, or I guess the rapport between them holds constant as
Yeah. So
as they become infinitesimal.
yeah, the notion of well, the whole theory of infinitesimal calculus is something that Leibniz invented, based on I mean, there are already some sort of precursors in ancient Greek mathematics and Fermat and later on and people like that. But he he and Newton independently invented the method of calculus, differential and integral calculus. And the interpretation that Leibniz gives is one that later in later mathematics was sort of criticized as being an inconsistent interpretation. But then more recently, there's been sort of a revival of a more, I guess, Leibnizian approach to understanding the foundations of calculus. But so Leibniz's understanding of how of what we're doing when we do calculus is that we take an approximation of a curve. So you can give any curve, whether it's drawn through a sort of accepted mathematical means, or it can be he gives like a sort of party game that he I don't know if he actually did this or not, but he says you take a piece of paper and you put a bunch of dots in it at random, and then you draw a curve that connects all the dots, and he says you can give an equation of this curve. And So to approximate a curve, you draw straight lines, and then the idea is that the shorter the lines, the straight lines, the closer they will be to the curve, and then once those lines become infinitely small, they will correspond to the curve at each point. And so you develop an equation of these infinitely small lines that gives the tangent, the straight line segment or the direction of the curve at each point. And So this infinitely small this infinitely small straight line segment has a certain ratio to the curve, and the shorter the shorter the approximating line segment, and eventually when it becomes infinitely small, the ratio corresponds to, it becomes a 1-to-1 ratio between the infinitely small line segment and the infinitely small segment of the curve. And so yes, this sort of conception of calculus for Leibniz is also connected with his metaphysical conception of infinity, because he holds that the world is a continuum in the sense of an actually existing infinity. So it's not just like for Aristotle, we can only conceive of a potential infinity of the universe in the sense that everything can be divided. There are no atoms. So every piece of matter that you take, you can divide it in half and divide each of those halves in half and continue performing that division process forever without reaching something indivisible. But for Aristotle, this doesn't imply that there is such a thing as an actual infinity. So it just means we can keep dividing as long as we want, but there's nothing that is already divided in infinitely many parts. Whereas for Leibniz, he thinks that the world is in fact divided into infinitely many parts. Each monad is a portion of the world, and there are infinitely many monads, and every portion of matter contains again an infinitely many sort of sub portions. Like he in the monadology, he talks about how if you look at a lake or a pond through a telescope, you just see sort of a flat surface. But then if you get closer to it, you'll see all the different plants and animals that live in this pond. And then if you sort of look at one of those animals, then you'll see all the different cells that make up the animal, and each of those cells contains more stuff, and so on to infinity. You never sort of run out of things that make up substances. So everything is composed of an infinite sort of collection of substances, and so on to infinity. And so this the actual infinity of the world and the continuity of the world is what sort of makes the calculus operations valid. So we can take an infinitely small segment of a curve because the curve is actually divided into infinitely small segments. And then the other bit that Simondon talks about here is Leibniz's physics, which so in contrast to Descartes' physics, Leibniz has this notion of vis viva, or living force, which more or less corresponds to what we today call kinetic energy. And so he gives, I think it's possibly in the monadology, I can't remember exactly where, but he gives the example of the amount of force needed to lift 1 pound, 1 foot in the air is, or sorry, to lift 1 pound, was it 4 feet in the air is the same as the amount of force to lift 2 pounds, 1 foot in the air, or something like that. I don't know if I have the exact quantities right. But whereas for Descartes, there's just a quantity of motion that is preserved, and so there's no the mass of the moving object doesn't intervene in Descartes' physics, and he ultimately wants to explain away the mass as an effect of the whirlpool of subtle matter surrounding the Earth. Whereas for Leibniz, the mass of the object intervenes is a part of the equation that defines the force that it takes to move that object. And so this is a more modern conception of force than Descartes' conception of the quantity of movement. Right. Yes. For Descartes, the solar system is a sort of giant whirlpool of subtle matter that sort of pushes the planets along their paths, and the subtle matter is sort of what fills up all the space between what we recognize as bodies and brings about their movement and sort of governs their motions. Okay, let's go on to the next section from extension is not divided.
I'm back.
Yes, yeah, we can hear you.
Extension not divided into finite itself infinity of the no reality is divided up in the world without being infinite way. And yet, if it were a matter of a single instant, this participation would be sufficient to ensure perfect automatism of the real as a whole. But the infinity of the world is a syncategorematic consisting in the impossibility of ever arriving at the last progression. The necessary complement to these syncategorematic infinities is a categorematic, which is the law of the series. and which is necessarily found outside it. Insofar as they are a series of changes, individual substances are the complement of a sensible unit. All the laws of the series that individuals are constitute an indefinite multiplicity. A hypercategorematic infinite is the law of this. Consequently, each individual substance contains the traces of its entire past, the seeds of its entire. Every substance is like an entire world, and like a mirror of God or of the whole universe. And the individual being is therefore a microcosm in a certain sense. But it can be wondered if the identification of living force with the first entelechy of an individual substance is compatible with this conception of substance. Living force is part of the system of actuality. It defines an actual energy, not a potential energy. And yet, potential energies are precisely the ones that are always energies relative to the state of a system, but not to an individual taken absolutely. They are energies of relation. There must be systems of individual potential energies. They give relation. However, to account for individuality, a certain potential must also be. The individual is not explained fully in the system of actuality. Leibniz wants to compose the world with individuals. Such is the difficulty of his system, which is expressed by the characteristics difficult to reconcile to of substance, which he defines by making it the center of his system. Oops, I pushed a button and it changed my page. Okay. According to Leibniz, Cartesianism, which contains the seeds of Spinozism, downplays the individuality of substances, with the soul as well as the body ceasing to be substances, become modes of thought or extension. For Leibniz, substance is inseparable from the predicates or accidents of which it is the subject, and it is inseparable from other substances. The only veritable realities reside in individuals or monads. Proclus designated by the term monads the unities of order inferior to the supreme, which in various aspects contained the whole multiplicity of the universe. Leibniz wants to make individual substance intelligible. All changes in the individual are deduced from its notion in accordance with the principle of sufficient reason. Quote, now it is obvious that predication has some foundation in the nature of things, and when a proposition is not identical, that is to say, when the predicate is not expressly in the subject, it must be virtually included in it, and this is what philosophers call in esse. So the notion of the subject term must always include that of the predicate, so that anyone who understood the subject notion perfectly would also judge that the predicate belongs. We can therefore say that the nature of an individual substance or of a complete being is to have a notion so complete that it is sufficient to include and to allow the deduction of all the predicates of the subject to which the notion is attributed. Thus, the contingent truths relative to the individual are necessary ex hypothesis. In this necessity, a metaphysical necessity? Is this necessity a metaphysical necessity? The objections made to Leibniz assert the incompatibility of this necessity and individuality. The geometer de Volder says, everything that follows from the nature of a thing is in this thing invariably, as long as this nature persists. It would therefore follow from the notion of individual substance that nothing is active by nature, for action is always the variation of creature. Arnauld, Arnauld made critiques oriented in the same way. It is not saying that all the changes in an individual are deduced from its notion, like the properties of a sphere are deduced from its definition, to suppress, along with agency and freedom, every kind of veritable individuality. God alone can envision the categorematic, which is reason making intelligible all the terms that constitute this categorematic infinite. And yet, it is the distinction between the understanding and the will in God that makes the solution possible. The categorematic infinite is not only what has been thought by God as possible, but also what is willed by him. For God to be able to think what he created, he had to make a choice among composable systems for the one that presented the maximum essence. Each created individual substance contains within it something of this world, which possesses the maximum essence. This is why it is necessary a priori. However, this necessity is a characteristic that is connected to the individual as a totality, not the individual posited relation. Here we again find this parameter that we call information today, which always appears when the problem of the information is what formed the essentia particularis affirmativa. It is information here that makes of the individual a necessary being and confers on it its microcosmic, through which it is an image of totality and a point of view. This parameter establishes the possibility of participation without ruining the distinction. Nevertheless, it is worth noting that this principle of maximum essence is an optative more than and yet it may be said that Leibniz's thought highlights one of the most important aspects of individuality, the fact that it based on the
Right, thanks. Yeah, so there's a lot in this passage. So maybe I'll start from the beginning. Right. There's this notion of syncategorematic and categorematic infinities, which I'm not sure if this is the term Leibniz uses or if this is just Simondon's term, but syncategorematic is a logical term that I have to look up every time I see it because I can never remember the definition. Um, but I posted the link in the chat there, but it has to do with the extent to which a term contributes to the meaning, contributes its own meaning to a statement that contains it. So a categorematic term is one that has meaning in itself or sort of in isolation, and then sort of contributes that meaning to expressions that contain it. Whereas a syncategorematic term is one that doesn't have a meaning in isolation, but sort of affects the meaning of expressions that contain it. And I think I'm not 100% sure, but I think here when Simondon talks about syncategorematic and categorematic infinity, I think we can sort of understand this to mean something like um, uh, potential infinity and actual infinity. So syncategorematic infinity would be potential infinity. And categorematic infinity would be actual infinity. But that's just my sort of hypothesis in reading this. I'm not 100% sure about that. But I think it's sort of supported by the passage, where is that? At the bottom of 588, he says, the infinity of the world is a syncategorematic infinity consisting in the impossibility of ever arriving at the last term of a progression. So this is a kind of potential infinity, infinity that consists only in the possibility of always continuing whatever operation. And then, so for Leibniz, there's the potential infinity of dividing up the world, but there's also the actual infinity of the world as divided. And each substance contains within it an actual infinity of sort of sub-substances. So each monad has associated to it an actual infinity of other monads that are sort of governed by it. And then there's also the notion of that I mentioned earlier about how the essence of an entity of a monad contains the entire history of that individual monad. So there's this discussion on 589 of the development of this of what is already sort of contained in the monad, and then each monad, by virtue of containing this actual infinity, also sort of mirrors the whole rest of the universe. So it's only because this monad or this monad is constituted the way it is, only because it exists in this particular universe that is constituted the way it is. Every monad sort of reflects the structure of the universe in which it exists, and so it's only because we exist in this universe that we are constituted the way that we are. And then Simondon returns to this question about the this question of the potentiality within the individual. And so he started this section on Leibniz by saying that Leibniz sort of reintroduces the notion of potential, but it's a kind of ambiguous potential because what the potential that an individual monad contains is in some respects already present throughout the history of that monad. So all of the transformations that the monad will undergo are already contained in the essence of that monad, and so there in certain respects you can describe all of this history of the monad as actual at the beginning of the development of that monad, as opposed to being potential. And so likewise in Leibniz's physics, we have this kinetic energy, this vis viva, but there's no concept of potential energy. So in the case of lifting a weight, for example, it takes a certain amount of force to lift the weight to a certain height, but then Leibniz has no account of the potential energy that the weight that is suspended contains, so that there's within the system, which consists of the weight being suspended or held up above the ground, for example, there's a potential energy in the sense that there's a capacity to perform work. There's a capacity to bring about a transformation of the system by dropping the weight, for example. And so Leibniz has no account in his physics for this potential energy. He just has the kinetic energy, so the actualized energy, and not the potential energy. And then, so there's more discussion of the way that the monad contains within it everything that qualifies it. So this is understood also in a logical sense. So in a proposition about any object, we can distinguish between what Kant will later call analytic and synthetic judgments. So we can say that certain judgments in certain judgments, the predicate is included in the concept of the subject. So like some of the stock examples are all bachelors are unmarried, for example. Unmarried is part of the concept of a bachelor. And then other propositions, in other propositions, the predicate is not included in the concept of the subject. So anything like, I don't know, red is my favorite color, or whatever sort of contingent proposition you want to take. But for Leibniz, these what seem to us to be synthetic propositions are actually analytic ones. It's just that we have only a limited knowledge of the subject. So if we had a complete knowledge of the subject, if we knew the essence of Julius Caesar as God knows it, then we would be able to deduce all of the properties from that essence. So the fact that he would cross the Rubicon, the fact that he would be assassinated, etc., all of these follow from the essence of Julius Caesar in the same way that the properties of a triangle follow from its essence. So this sort of inherence of attributes in the subject is a kind of logical proposition as well as a metaphysical one.
Could I get
Right? So we talked about this a little bit. I think it may have been before you joined, but we talked about how for the way that Leibniz tries to distinguish his understanding of his sort of philosophical system, the way he tries to distinguish it from Spinoza is by introducing this distinction between the metaphysical necessity of that makes up the compossibility of various essences on the one hand, and then the moral necessity of God choosing the best possible world. So he tries to sort of insert this moment of freedom in God. So God freely chooses to select to pick out the best possible world, or the optimal world in terms of the degree of essence that it realizes. So the necessity within God is a moral necessity because God is infinitely good and wants to realize the most essence possible. And so it's not the same kind of determinism that we find in Spinoza, where God is acts through metaphysical or logical necessity in not creating the world, but in sort of constituting the world. So this notion of optimality is a kind of ontological optimality in the sense that it's an understanding of how the different essences that make up a world are possible together, and so certain essences sort of align with each other in such a way that they can form a world together, whereas other essences don't align in the correct way, or they align in such a way as to produce a less perfect world. So this optimality of the world, or the fact that this world is the best possible world, means that it's the world out of all the possible ones that contains the most of these essences that were possible, and joins them together into one world in the optimal way. Yeah, and then I think it might have also been before you mentioned, but I did also talk a little bit about I talked about the variational principles in physics, and the various physical principles that either maximize or minimize a given quantity. And these were both part of what inspired Leibniz's understanding of the best possible world, and also in part later were inspired by Leibniz's philosophical system. And these sort of variational principles in physics are still used today. So it's not sort of a obsolete kind of physics. There are even though this notion of the best possible world seems sort of hopelessly antiquated in certain respects, in other respects, this notion of physical interactions that maximize or minimize a particular quantity is still in use today. Okay, let's go on to the next bit. I can read the last couple paragraphs of the Leibniz section. Leibniz's optimism is therefore a very important aspect of his system, which is not necessarily connected to creationism. In fact, beneath the idea of creation in the system of compossibles, there is the idea of the distinction between the quantitative material existence of a being and the maximum essence presented by a system of reality that does not possess any additional quantitative material existence. Here, order becomes a characteristic of the system of individuals, while in Descartes it was that through which the individual manifested and exerted its inventive force. But the order constituting the individual's substance or being, its instrument of creation, is always this parameter that is distinct from the quantity of matter. This parameter is essential to the individual, either as a condition of its existence or as means of its action, or as an aspect of its existence in the form of affirmative particular essence. The discovery of this notion constitutes the new character of 17th century thought and allows it to free itself from the old impasses of this question of individuality. This discovery undergirds all the images of automatism and mechanism that we come across in various forms throughout all the authors of the 17th century who deal with individuality, even when they are preoccupied with other problems corresponding more so to what the customary discussions proposed for reflexive thought. So this last bit here is sort of a transition to the next section about the 18th century, and then which is just, I think, one paragraph, and then we have a long section on Rousseau. And so what Simondon is suggesting here is that this notion of order is sort of the reflection in Leibniz of the relation between individuals. So whereas for Leibniz, the individual contains within itself, it contains all of its qualities within itself. The individuals are sort of self-contained. There's a famous line from Leibniz that monads have no windows for qualities to enter or exit from. But at the same time, this notion of the order of the world, or the sort of configuration of the universe in such a way as to contain the maximum possible essence, is a kind of representation or reflection of this notion of what is external to the individual in Leibniz's system. And this notion of order as something external to the individual, Simondon calls it here a parameter, which is a sort of, he thinks it's a sort of new notion that is developed more in the 18th century, of how the individual sort of interacts with other individuals, either in just a physical sort of mechanical interaction, or we can talk about social interaction of human individuals and so on. This sort of conception of the individual as being in part constituted by its interactions with other individuals is what Simondon is going to suggest is sort of new, or the new development of the 18th century. Okay, are there any comments or questions about the last bit from Leibniz?
I'm trying to reconcile those.
Yeah, I think the way Simondon was presenting it here, I think he sees this this notion of the order of the universe, or the compossibility of the monads, as a sort of moment where Leibniz sort of goes beyond his own sort of official, position that monads don't interact with each other. So for Leibniz, in terms of how he actually sets out his system, is that the monads don't interact and they have this pre-established harmony. Each of them sort of evolves on its own terms, and it's only because the world is ordered in the way it is that it looks like we have interaction between substances. But at the same time, this notion of the order or the compossibility of these monads is a kind of I guess, recognition in a way by Leibniz, even though he doesn't want to sort of acknowledge this officially, is a kind of recognition of the importance of that interaction or relation with other entities that is essential to the constitution of the monad. So it's only because the world is ordered in the way it is that a given monad is constituted the way it is. It's the monad reflects the world that it is a part of, and this sort of reflection is a sort of acknowledgement by Leibniz, sort of against his will, of the essential contribution that interaction makes to the composition of the individual.
Wait, I recalling exactly monadal where he attempts.
Yeah, I think for Simondon, it's ultimately impossible to fully explain that sort of bit within Leibniz, because Leibniz himself is sort of trying to put together two ideas that are ultimately irreconcilable. But so Simondon wants to sort of overcome this difficulty that Leibniz tried to handle unsuccessfully, and so Simondon wants to understand the individual as not as a self-contained substance that is also somehow a reflection of the world, but see the individual as being in part constituted by its interaction with other individuals and with its surrounding environment.
Right, yeah, I guess one maybe.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. I mean, I'm definitely not a Leibniz scholar. I've read some Leibniz stuff, but his collected works are like 100 volumes in various languages, and like some of them are like letters that he sent to people, and others are like sort of private notes that he wrote to himself on the back of an envelope or whatever. And yeah, so like just getting a handle on like the corpus of Leibnizian text is already like a pretty massive enterprise, and I'm certainly not adequately familiar with that corpus to be able to give a good answer to that question. But I think I'm sure there are Leibniz scholars who have addressed this seeming difficulty between the sort of two ways of looking at the constitution of a monad, and tried to reconcile the two.
Definitely, I always.
Yeah, he's like, if you want to make like a list of like the most intellectually productive people in history, Leibniz would be like either number one or maybe number two after Aristotle. But like his like the amount of stuff he wrote, and then almost everything he writes is like inventing a new field of study, like sort of as a pastime, and then sort of like leaving it to other people to develop. Um, his sort of intellectual fruitfulness and productivity is like hard to fathom sometimes. I think he does briefly. Let me just flip through and see if I can find it. 18th century. Yeah, he briefly talks about Comte in the beginning in the section on the 19th century. He just sort of alludes to him, but he doesn't go into Comte's system in any detail. But yeah, Comte was another person who I don't know his work very well, but like he lectured on like the entirety of science as it existed at his time, and he apparently did it like without consulting any books or anything. He just like sort of knew all this stuff, and expounded the system of science as a whole, as it existed in like the 1820s or whatever. And yeah, that was his sort of encyclopedic knowledge of science at the time.
I don't want to right now soil it the best of all possible.
Yes, there's a certain atmosphere of 18th century philosophy that we can, I think, appreciate. But yeah, so we'll eventually get to the 19th century. Simondon is a lot more concise in the 19th century. Like there's only a few pages on the whole 19th century, and he gives let's see, what do we have? He does talk about Kant a little bit, but only in connection with other people. Like he doesn't have a section on Kant, which is kind of weird. But then he talks about some of the French political philosophers in the 19th century, and then he talks a little bit about German idealism, Fichte and Schelling, and he ends with a little section on Hölderlin. but yeah, we'll get there eventually. We have a long section on Rousseau to get through, which should probably take at least 2 sessions to get through, maybe more.
See now. Well, yeah, I'm looking.
Yeah, that's we'll get to that next week. Okay, cool. So thanks everyone for coming out. We'll start on the 18th century and then Rousseau, and we'll go from there next time.
That sounds good. Thanks, Han. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. See you next week.